thank you for all being here. This is where we get the really serious, wonky part of CPAC, which means you do not immediately now head for the doors. Look, China, Russia, big tech. What could possibly go wrong? You know, if we'd had this conversation 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we wouldn't have thought, well, that's a problem, right? Russia, we beat Russia during the Cold War. They're finished. China, as even Joe Biden said a year ago, hey, man, they're not going to eat our lunch. They're our friends. They're not competitors. And we would have all happily turned over every bit of our personal information to Amazon, Google, Facebook, you name it. But here we are, and the world is a very different place. And we now have a pretty serious conversation to have. I want to start with China. You know, China's plan, and they've been quite open about it in recent years. 10 years ago they weren't, now they're very open about it. They plan to replace the United States as the dominant world power, economically, technologically, militarily, politically, diplomatically. Their original plan was to do it by mid-century. They've pulled up the timeline between the pandemic and the election of Joe Biden, who they know will be very soft on China. They've now pulled up the timeline. They think they're going to get there within the decade and maybe within the next 5 years, and they might. The next issue, though, is Russia. Russia, we thought they were gone. They were done. They can't compete as a serious world power. What did Barack call them? Barack Obama? Oh, some regional third world power, basically. Well, the Russians are back, and the Russians are back in the cyber technology, but this time it's different. With Putin, it's personal. I mean, Putin saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, he blamed the United States, he blamed the West, and so it's payback time. He knows he can't compete with China or even the United States, but what he wants to do is be a spoiler. He wants to muck around in our elections, and he wants to hack into the American technology and in every other thing. So he's a problem, but it's a personal problem. But then the final thing is big tech. You know, three months ago, we all thought they might have been our friends. And now it's cancel culture, they've deplatformed people, they are becoming political adversaries of free speech in the conservative movement. So with that, I want to just turn to our experts. And I'd like to start first with Buck Sexton, who's going to talk to us about the Russia threat, and then Rebeccah Heinrichs about China, and then our former Attorney General, who's going to tell us about big tech. And we're going to ask them all, what are we going to do about it? So Buck, would you like to take off?
So I would ask that you think about how you view the success of the Russian information operation in 2016. Because most conservatives think about this in the context of, it was wildly exaggerated, it didn't change the election, and that's all true. But there's also a follow-up to that. Russia was actually more successful in 2016 with the pretty minimal hacking that they did in terms of the election and Facebook and all the things you know about than they ever could have really imagined. When you look at the cascade of effects that came after that, and yes, this is only possible because of the Democratic Party and the Russia collusion hoax. KT, you could speak to that in more detail than I can, having been closer to that, and the way the Democrats turned this into a weapon. But what Russia was able to do was create the grounds for one, a 4-year-long story that they still cling to. I mean, you will see people on news today still who say that Russia collusion was real, that it still happened in some capacity. Collusion's not a crime. We didn't say conspiracy. They play that game. But also, you have the beginnings of big tech now in full-out censorship mode because of the 2016 narrative of Russia hacking the election, and all the people, the Democrats, woke folks on the left, decided something must be done about this to stop it. That's actually the justification for why people like me, even, and many others at this conference, are being censored on social media. It all goes back to that 2016 hacking. And then when you add to this that Putin right now, they actually just put Navalny, who's the most well-known critic of Moscow and essentially anti-corruption crusader, they sent him to a penal colony. That was just a few hours ago, that was reported. So that's what you don't want to have happen. Russia now, and we can talk about some of the specific platforms they use, is in a position where they can say, if American political tech, or American tech rather, can be politicized to squash dissent on effectively a partisan basis, why can't we? Think about the precedent that has been set. Think about the layers here. You had 4 years of Russia collusion nonsense against Trump, then you had big tech weighing in, and now you have actual autocrats around the world saying, if Twitter and Facebook can block conservatives from having speech, guess what we can do in Moscow? And I haven't even gotten to the fact that they're still more skilled at hacking than the Chinese, although the Chinese are a bigger threat, but I will leave it there.
Pretty scary. Rebeccah, what are the Chinese up to?
What I'd like to do is start off by saying, why do we talk about China and Russia? Why are those the two big countries we talk about most? And that is because when you think about the threats to the United States, you think about what is the country's objective and what is their ability to carry out that objective. And of those two countries, China, as KT said, has the desire, the will to replace the United States as the global superpower, and now they have the greatest ability to carry that out, economically, militarily, and then tech. And I'm going to talk most about that third basket. Russia, still a very serious problem, doesn't have the same kind of engine that China has economically. They have a lot of nuclear weapons, and so they are a serious competitor that we care about greatly, and they have the desire to undermine the United States, but they don't have the engine and the ability like China has to carry out just the amount of destruction that China can to undermine the United States and replace the United States as the global preeminent power. Why does it matter for the United States to remain the global preeminent power? Because the country that has the biggest economy and the biggest military and the most alliances and partners is going to be able to put our fingerprint on things like trade, on things like travel and commerce. And we know, certainly as conservatives and as Americans, that the United States has the moral high ground there. We want to put the United States' influence on things like trade and global business, et cetera, and commerce. And so we have to fight for that. Now, that means militarily it was Donald Trump. It was the Trump administration that said, enough is enough. The United States is going to have our lunch eaten, Joe Biden, if we don't do something about it, and it's going to happen by the Chinese Communist Party. And so what does that mean? It means we have to start competing. And it was the Trump administration that really oversaw this seismic shift and helped the United States to take the Chinese threat seriously. And so we have to put money into our military to make sure that we are deterring Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific. We want to stand with our Taiwanese partners, great contributors to the free world, our South Korean allies, our Japanese allies, our Australian allies. And we want to make sure that we are able to make good on our security commitments to them and that China can't push us out. That's the military piece. Economically, that's why we get into trade, a trade war with the Chinese. But on tech, the Chinese want to use technology to censor and to steal. Remember those two things, censor and steal. That's how they do it. And so they do it by having these 5G. It's the next generation technology abilities, a fast speed internet. Again, the previous administration said we have to have clean network initiative. Our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was the face of that. He said the UK can't have their Huawei, and we can't deal with these other technology companies, Chinese companies, and 5G networks. It has to be clean, and we can't let them take our data and take our allies' data as well. And so you have to have clean network technology. So it's going to take a federal level. We can't let ZTE and these other companies steal the United States' information technology, and we can't let them censor the United States. And so those are the big things. It's going to take federal level, state level. We've got a great example here in Florida with a state representative that KT knows well. Her daughter is a state representative here, introduced a piece of legislation to make sure that Floridians have to concede, they have to agree to have their data handed over to technology companies, to take ownership of their own technology. So it's going to take federal level work, state level work, and it's going to take individual. This is my last point. You individually have to care that your data is not being sucked up by the Chinese Communist Party and by big tech. You have to care enough. because they can muscle us out, but they can also win by our acquiescence, and that's something that we can't do. So look and see what technology you're using. Do not buy commercial technology and drones off the shelf that are made in China. There's no distinction in China between the private sector and the military. They take all of it and they apply it, put it in artificial intelligence and quantum
computing.
To sift through all of that information, data, and weaponize it against us. And I will leave it at there to continue our discussion.
Well, I think that leads pretty easily. It's great. So between the two of you, we're now on the big data and big tech, and are they the enemy?
Yeah, well, obviously, how many people here have lost followers on social media recently?
Oh.
How many have lost 10,000 plus followers on social media? I know both KT and I have experienced that when the purge happened on Twitter. And the same thing happens on Facebook. And big tech is not our friend. And they are too powerful. They are too ubiquitous. They are too important. And I know that all of us here could talk for hours on this subject. But the real thing that I want to leave you with is it's not just losing followers. It's not just not being able to communicate. I mean, our First Amendment rights, obviously, protect our speech in the public square. But right now, Twitter, Facebook, and other social medias are controlling and regulating your speech. I think inconsistent with American values, quite frankly. I think an American company that doesn't allow everyone to speak, no matter if you, in fact, I think most of us grew up and believe to this day that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it to the death, quite frankly. That's not what big tech's about. Big tech is now manipulating data and thereby manipulating public opinion and elections by what you see and how you see it. As much so as they study the color of the background to see how effective and persuasive messaging can become. We are being manipulated beyond what our brains can comprehend. But that's not even the scariest thing, my friends. The scariest thing that I've seen, and many of you have iPhones, and your iPhone reminds you sometimes, do you want this app you're using to use your location all the time or only when you're using it? Well, if you've seen what's behind it, which I have, and I'm sure several of you have, that data and that location data is now being anonymized and sold to see the behaviors of individuals. But if you anonymize location data at someone's house, there's only 2-3 people that live in that house. And then you can follow that little dot, and I've seen it done to the extreme where they followed a terrorist until he was eliminated by his cell phone location data. Because one of those apps, and you have lots of apps on your phone, follow you everywhere you go. And so that power that we have now given and we don't control is the scariest thing as I look at what our future holds. Because like this title of this panel says, KT, that data is for sale and it's being bought by people that don't like us very much. Not just marketers, not just people that want to sell you things, but countries that are hostile to our interest and the American interest. And so I wish I had better news. As a former acting attorney general and a proud supporter of Donald Trump, I wish I could tell you that in the 4 years we accomplished a lot, and we did. But on this front, I fear that big tech is winning. Because with the Biden administration and their stance towards big tech, I don't think they're going to fight back on your behalf. And I don't think your ability to speak freely about how you feel about current events and issues of the day and who you support politically, I don't feel like those rights are going to be protected by this administration. So what does that mean? That means what we always have to do. We have to regroup. We have to stand for something and then convince others, changing hearts and minds, knowing that we are up against a massive mountain. But I think it's possible. I think we are seeing with this bill that's in Florida, and I think a lot of the individual personal information protections that we could see both move federally and then the states, I think we can take back some of the control, not only of the content that we create, but the personal information that we don't even know we're giving up. So I'll turn it, it's going to be a great discussion, so I'll turn it back over to you, KT, And we
And let's go at it. Okay, so Buck, you're in the media world hours a day on the radio and television. How do you stop it? I mean, are the Chinese everywhere? Because it just seems like they're in our media, they're in our economic institutions for sure, they're at the Confucius Institutes. I mean, can you stop it, and should you stop it?
I think it's fascinating when you look, we were talking about Russia and China, and Russia is clearly the secondary concern, despite what you may have seen in the media for leading up until now, of course. But the Russians are very good at hacking. The Chinese are very good at stealing enormous amounts of data through cyber, to the point where I think you would have to say that you'd go back to the era of the Soviet Union, you'd go back to the KGB and some of their efforts, and this dwarfs that. Because back in the days, you know, KT, you needed to have somebody, pretty much, who got access to documents, who could carry them out. Now we don't even know the full scope and scale of how much is being stolen. The way I describe it on radio, with the Chinese specifically, is that this is civilization shifting level knowledge transfer. And it's the kind of thing that you don't necessarily understand the full ramifications of it until all of a sudden you realize whose fifth generation fighters are better, who's building a few aircraft carriers after not long ago. China doesn't want a blue water navy. Who remembers that? That was the smart analysis. That analysis was wrong. There's a lot of places now where you look and see the Chinese are actually out ahead of us technologically. We talked about quantum computing, 5G, where are they, where are we? And how do we stop it? Whereas the Russians come in, smash and steal, the Chinese coerce and co-opt. The Chinese Communist Party has very, very deep pockets, is incredibly sophisticated, and you see this in the way that they use college campuses, for example, and people that are doing innocuous research projects, things along those lines. How do you stop it, KT? That's the question you asked. The first step is a wake-up call, I think, for the country that I believe Donald Trump started. I'm not sure we're fully at the point yet where people understand how pervasive this is. But when NBA superstars will certainly say whatever they want about American politics, but will say, oh, I've got nothing to say about China, that brings it into the popular mindset. How powerful is this country that our globally recognized celebrity ultra-millionaires are afraid of crossing them?
Yeah,
That's
self-censoring. They're self-censoring.
Of course, they're self-censoring, and the access to the Chinese market for even the most powerful companies and corporations is too powerful at this point for us to expect any of them to put American interests first.
You know, Charlie Kirk said something I thought was really interesting. Don't expect Washington to go after big tech, because big tech's in their pockets, and they're not going to do it. You have to do it at the state level. But what's the prospect of that? I mean, can 50 individual states say, we want big tech out of our lives? We want China out of our lives? I mean, Matt, you know, talk me through that one.
There's a lot we can do with the states, and I hope that we have not completely given up on electing courageous individuals that are willing to advance the things we care about. So I'm not yet willing to give up on the fact that we can elect members of Congress like Matt Gaetz, or you know, senators, you know, that are willing to do the people's work. And if they're not, then we should question our whole very being. But I think in the near term, I think you're absolutely right. I think state legislatures around the country are going to have to lead on this front. And you know, but it's always been, they've been the laboratories of innovation. And I think once, you know, the people speak through the states, then will find the right regulatory scheme to take back some of this, you know, power that is contained in our data.
You said something really interesting, Rebeccah. You were talking about the Chinese plan to replace the United States technologically. So are we still, I mean, we think of ourselves, right, as we're the technological superpower. The only thing the Chinese have is what they steal, and the Russians don't have much of anything. But are we really still the cutting edge of technology? Are we the drivers of world technology? Because, you know, technology drives the future. And if we're not there, then who has the commanding heights of technology?
In many of the key fields, we still are, but the Chinese are engaged in massive espionage. I mean, to steal our technology, to be educated in our universities, especially in these STEM programs, you know, the hard sciences, to learn what we're doing here. And of course, they're exploiting the American benevolence and kindness. We want to have this open system where they come here and then learn the American way. But that's not what's happening. They're coming here. The Chinese Communist Party has long tentacles that reach across the ocean. And so it's just because you have a Chinese national here studying in our universities, we want them to have a taste of the American dream, but many of these individuals are still members of the Chinese Communist Party and taking that information and that knowledge and going back and pouring it into their own fields.
What the heck are they doing with it, though? Okay, so they're stealing our medical information. They're stealing our personal data. I mean, are they designing biological weapons that will only affect America? I mean, what are they doing with all this stuff?
Well,
they're vacuuming it up like mad.
They're certainly eroding the commercial advantages that we have. When you look at some of the most valuable companies in the world, they're largely built on intellectual property. You look at the algorithms that run Google. You look at different companies, whether you're talking about aerospace and defense. I mean, clearly the military and intelligence applications of what they're doing that's a huge driver behind this. But they've also made commercial espionage something that is, again, on an unprecedented in human history scale. We've never seen anything like this before in terms of the duration as well as the actual sheer volume. And KT, I mean, you and I both know from the government side, it's hard to even understand how much of this we're catching, how much of this we're not catching, a lot of companies don't even want to admit when they've been essentially robbed by cyber.
So I asked a tech expert, the former White House chief information officer, I said, well, what about these companies? Why are they not protecting my data? And she said, you know something, KT? They found this easier to buy insurance. Okay. And if they're hacked, then they have to pay the insurance out and they figure it out. It's much less expensive and much easier than for them to take all the steps they have to take to protect your data.
I got a nice little, I used to work at the CIA, which is why I think they put me up here on this specific topic, and I got a nice little note from the Office of Personnel Management in the mail saying that, they didn't say China, but it basically was China, got all your stuff, good luck.
I think they refer to it as a state actor.
Here's 6 months of identity theft protection. They robbed my government file, they know more about me than most of my friends, and I had, some sort of a notification if somebody tries to buy a house in my name in Beijing. That's
and on that point too, KT, I think it's important to remember, and some of these Republican senators are putting these Biden nominees on the spot in their Senate confirmation hearings, which is great. And that is, they're saying, listen, are you going to treat American companies as American companies first, not these transnational, no loyalty to a set country? That's the problem. Over the last many decades, companies that got really rich because of our system, because of the system that we have that's great for ingenuity, great for business, that's great for transparency and accountability, all of those things, they forgot where they're from and who they owe their loyalty to. And they've become these global companies. And so we have to get back to saying, no, all of Google, Twitter, all of these companies, they owe it to Amazon. They need to be American companies first and foremost.
I want to go back to something you said, because I think it is far-fetched that the Chinese would take our data, release a pathogen or a virus on the United States, and then cripple our economy. I don't think that will happen in our lifetime. But in all joking aside, we still are the innovation capital of the world. You look at how we created the vaccines in record time.
Yeah, who would have thought? China sent it on the world, and America cured it.
They had it before we had it, and they still haven't really produced an effective vaccine like we have. And so America is still the global leader in innovation. The challenge is exactly what the other panelists point out, and that is the Chinese understand that, and they want to be in a position that once we prove a concept, they can steal it. And so that's why things like Huawei routers, which you mentioned, need to be taken out of the entire U.S. communication system. Yeah, we cannot have a Huawei router in the United States. The 5G, the Chinese were very involved in development of the 5G protocol for the first time really in the world sort of system of creating those protocols. And I think one of the reasons they were so involved was so that they could seed any network with an ability to take down the data that crosses that network. It's a scary time, and if we don't wake up and if our leaders don't wake up, I think we're in for a long-term struggle against the Chinese.
Sleepy Joe's not going to wake up, by the way. No. The Chinese are going to get their way with him.
The bottom line of all of this is it's a wake-up call. It's, 2 minutes to midnight. We really have to, as a nation, figure this out, whether it's to break up big tech, whether it's to maintain the commanding heights of technology, whether it's to go after protect our systems as a national government or as state governments. But this doesn't go away. This only gets worse And I fear very much politically with the Biden administration, hey man, they're our friends. They're not gonna eat our lunch. Guess what? They wanna eat our breakfast, lunch, dinner, and make us pay for it. Thank you very much for all of your time and attention. Thank you.